I'm going to try not to stumble over you. I move around a lot, and I don't like to stand at the podium, so. You know, I want to say something before I begin, because I don't want to interrupt at the end with this. But that is, I am going to be sharing a talk this afternoon that I think you'll find very interesting. I hope you can stay by after lunch or come back at 2 o'clock. I'm going to be talking about epigenetics and cell regeneration, and I guarantee you'll be amazed. It's remarkable what science is doing in those fields. So I'll be talking about that and taking questions and answers then after that. Thank you. So I'm going to be talking this morning about double heart disease. Yes, thank you. That makes good sense. And did you realize that you have two hearts? That the human body is, in essence, has two hearts. In fact, I want to ask you a question, a thought exercise, before I begin. If you were to go to the physician, if you went to a doctor, and you didn't actually have a serious problem, you were just going for a checkup, what would be the organ or the thing that you would most want to be sure that the doctor checked out and took care of? Well, the vast majority of us say, well, it'd be my heart. Right? You want to be sure that your ticker is working just like it should. And but I'm going to, by the time we finish, I think you're going to change your mind about what the most important thing you want the doctor to check out when you go to see the doctor. So I'm going to be talking to you about the fact we have a heart in our chest, the chest heart, but also, as a man thinketh in his heart, he's talking about a different organ, not the pump in our chest, but it's in the brain. Now, we all know that heart disease is still the number one killer. More people in America, in fact, in the world, more people die from heart disease than any other, than any other cause. And did you realize that if we could back time up just 2 minutes from the heart attack, that heart would actually have been suitable for a transplant? In most cases, the heart muscle does not have any problem when the person dies from a heart attack. A few moments before. And why? Because the real problem is a blood clot that blocked the blood flow to the coronary artery. This is a pathologist slide, and this is the, it's blown up very large, but this is an artery to the heart, and you can see that it's got a plaque. This is called an atheroma, or we call it a plaque. And do you realize that there was just a tiny opening right here for the blood flow? If you've heard of people that had a bypass and they said they had a 90% blockage, I don't know. I'm not a pathologist. I don't know if that's 90% or 99%. But anyway, this was a artery with a blockage. So, two hearts in the human body, one in the chest, the one that we're most familiar with. Do you realize that your heart beats 30 million times a year? 3 billion times in a lifetime. And do you know that the very first thing that we can see or recognize in a developing fetus, or even a chicken egg, if you've done this as a child in school, they actually showed you the first thing you can identify is the heart. And that's before there's actually any blood, okay? And if you think about it, if the heart stops for a few seconds, you pass out. If it doesn't start back in a few minutes, you don't wake up. So it's not surprising that this is considered a very important organ. But there's another heart in the human body. And it's been recognized, and now we're actually doing amazing research in medicine and science on the brain. And we realize that this heart resides in the frontal lobes of the brain. Now, whereas the chest heart is continually beating to pump blood, the brain heart is continually making new connections. Let me ask you a question. we've got this little fellow here, I understand, who just had a 1-year birthday. So 1 year, or maybe it's handsome, maybe it's a girl. I think it's a boy, right? But anyway, a youngster. And do you realize that by the time he gets my age, his brain will be full of all kinds of information, right? But it will not be a whole lot bigger. So how do we get all that information into the same amount of space? And it's because the connections between the neurons in your brain is where the information is stored. Did you know that modern science can now read with about 90% accuracy what you're going to say before you say it? A few milliseconds before you say it, with the technology we have now, the computer can tell us what you're going to say. That's remarkable. My wife is a very practical lady. I didn't introduce her, I usually do, but Sally, she's the one that was sitting next to me. Sally's a very practical person, and she says, well, why don't you wait a few milliseconds and you'll know for sure what they're going to say. And that's true. But if you don't have a voice box, if you cannot speak, this technology will soon be a very, a great boon. You know, that's what we need, right, is a few more people that can talk. So, can't read your thoughts, though. Cannot read your thoughts yet. I want to, how many of you have heard of Phineas Gage? You've heard of this story. Okay. Well, do you know Phineas Gage, for those who don't know, Phineas Gage is famous because of an accident he had. In fact, he looks like a soldier there, right, with his rifle, but that's not a rifle. Phineas Gage had a job that, and he lived in the 1800s, this is an old story, but it's still, I'm going to show you something very remarkable. He lived in the 1800s, and yet he's still being published in medical science today. Because his job was to tamp the dirt on the dynamite charge that was put in the ground, you know, for civil engineering projects where they're doing a lot of earth moving. And one day the unthinkable happened. As he was tamping on that dirt, the charge went off. And it turned that rod that he's holding right here into a missile. And that missile went right up through his eye socket and out the top of his head. But Phineas lived. He didn't get an infection. He lived. In fact, if you look, you can see his eye is closed there, his left eye that was destroyed. And here, I just show you, in the 2012, they're publishing an article about Phineas Gage and why. And by the way, this is actually his skull. His skull has been preserved. And you can see the hole in the top and where this thing went through. So what we're doing is they're using modern knowledge about the brain and computer simulation, and they're trying to understand the connections that were destroyed when this metal rod went up through his head. And basically, he had almost like a frontal lobotomy. Okay, basically separated his frontal lobes from the rest of his brain. And here's some more of the pictures. I'm sure you'll all run out and read that article. But the point is, Phineas Gage is famous because he had a brain injury that completely changed his personality. Whereas Phineas had been a responsible family man, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that what I've read, he was a supervisor of a team. He became a complete profligate. He didn't care about work. He spent all of his money, left his family. Actually went, as I understand it, he went to South America, and he came back. He died in San Francisco, and that's how we have his skull. So it changed his personality and character as a result of the connections that were destroyed in his brain. Now, so the two hearts, all right? You've heard of heart transplants, right? Do you realize that yesterday there were hundreds of people in the United States that had their chests cut open, had the clamps pulled apart, and they actually cut the heart out of their chest and put somebody else's heart in their chest. And it wasn't even in the newspaper. I think that's pretty amazing stuff. We do it so often now, it's not even news, is it? And yet it is an amazing operation. But how about this one? Suppose that when we get the brain transplant, That's going to be front page news. You know, that's what there are many who are working on this project, this idea, this ability to do a brain transplant. But I have to ask you a question. Now, if you had a problem with your chest heart, and there was a doctor that was able to transplant someone else's heart, most of you would say, sure, I will do that. But suppose that you had a problem with your brain, and they said, well, I'll give you a brain transplant. Would you be interested? Well, before you answer, think about this. A heart transplant is a donor heart, but a brain transplant is a donor body. That's putting somebody else's brain in your body. And I have not yet found the first person who's actually interested in having a brain transplant. So, I don't know. This is still good, nice science, but I'm not really sure how practical it's going to be. So now what does that tell us? The brain, you believe that your brain heart is more important than your chest heart. In fact, I'll tell you what I think. I think the reason that we're willing to have them cut our chest open it up, and put somebody else's heart in our chest is because of our brain heart. We want to keep the brain heart going. Because did you know that about 25% of the output from your chest heart goes to your brain? So you can't live without. Now, there's two hearts, but do you realize that the thing that kills the chest heart is also the thing that kills the brain heart? There's one killer. What is that killer? Well, you remember I showed you this picture? The blood clot to the coronary artery, it blocked the blood flow, and it destroys the tissue. And the heart does die when that happens. Well, the same thing happens in the brain. What do we call it when it happens in the brain? We call it a stroke. But increasingly, we're calling it a brain attack because it's the same thing that happens in the brain that happens in the heart. It's a blockage, an arterial sclerosis. That's what this is trying to represent here, is the blockage and then the blood clot. Now, there's a very important concept here I want you to get, and that is there's a 90% correlation between blockages in your arteries in your body, because we call it heart disease, but do you know it's not actually heart disease? I already explained that. What is it? It's blood vessel disease, right? It's a blood vessel to the heart that's the problem. Okay, turns out that this disease happens everywhere in your body. So if you have a blockage in one place, you have a 90% likelihood of having a blockage somewhere else. And so here we're talking about the carotid artery that's in your neck. The plaques in your carotid artery will allow us as doctors to predict or to get a sense of how bad the blockages are in your heart. Okay? And it's a lot less invasive. We can do it with an ultrasound on your neck, but if we do it in your heart, it's much more invasive. So now watch. I've given you some information. Now we're going to connect the dots for you. In the next few slides, I want you to draw some conclusions. The two hearts are affected differently by lack of blood flow. What is the common symptom, or what's the common way that lack of blood flow to the chest heart manifests? Who can tell me? It's really a simple question. Yeah, but before that, pain. Ooh, I mean the ones who've had it. I've never had it, but I have patients who have. And one guy told me, it was like an elephant sitting on my chest. Just so oppressive. I mean, you just dull, serious pain. It can be in the jaw, right? Did you know it can also be in the back? Little lesson there. But let me ask you, how is the brain heart affected by lack of blood flow? Now, before you answer, because there'll be few of you, some, but few of you who know the correct answer, because we naturally think it would be pain. But it turns out that the brain is a unique organ, and there's no sensation of pain inside the dura mater, the little lining, the little fibrous capsule around the brain. Inside that, the neurons do not have pain. Now, blood vessels in the brain do. That's why, migraine headache comes from the blood vessel, not from the brain. So there's no pain. So what is the symptom of lack of blood flow to the brain? Well, let me tell you a little experiment. This made a big impression on me, even though I was an old medical student. This definitely got my full attention. They did an experiment where they put some cannula, they call it anyway, into the carotid arteries of a subject who was awake and willing, a volunteer, and they began to introduce carbon dioxide into the blood, going to the brain. Now, what would that be? What would that do? If you put carbon dioxide, you would deprive the brain of oxygen. And by turning up the amount, they were able to see what happened to the person when they had just a little bit less oxygen to the brain. And then as they continued the experiment, they turned the numbers up until the person had a great deficit of oxygen to the brain. And I remember watching the video of this person in the experiment. Do you know what the first symptoms were? Now, I have to tell you something. I haven't always been a Seventh-day Adventist Christian. I wasn't raised as a Christian, and I was in my 20s, mid to late 20s before I became a Christian. So I just want to explain that, especially to the children. I have been drunk, okay? I have smoked and done a lot of other things that are not good for your health that a lot of worldly people do. And so I saw this person. They were acting like they had been drinking. I mean, I was thinking that the way that they were acting with just a little bit of lack of blood flow to the brain was like they were inebriated. And then as he turned it up more and less oxygen to the brain, the person actually started to have trouble with memory. I remember the guy, I still have this mental image, but this guy in the video was holding this up saying, "Joe, what is it?" And Joe was going like this. He knew what it was, he couldn't say it. So I want to ask you a question. Let me show you something. If you go to the doctor and get a checkup, Tim Russert is a good example. Tim Russert, y'all know who that was, right? Meet the press. He died of a heart attack a little over a year ago. Did you know that he had a checkup, even by his cardiologist, less than 2 months before he died? You see, we can only tell if you have a blockage in the arteries to your heart if the blockage is over 70%, because there's so much reserve capacity to the heart. So your heart can change rate so much. If we had a big, it suddenly got dark outside and flashes of lightning and the ground was shaking, your heart rate would double before you even got out of your chair, in many cases. So there's a lot of reserve capacity to the chest heart. But what about to the brain heart? Did you know that the brain works about the same amount while you're asleep as it does while you're awake? It's doing different things, but your brain is consuming approximately the same amount of glucose and oxygen when you're sleeping as when you're awake. So there's not a lot of reserve capacity, and we can actually see differences in the functioning of your brain heart when it only has 20% of a blockage. Okay, now watch this. Where do most of us live? I know, I'm not talking about Christiansburg. Where do most of us live on our atherosclerosis? Do you know that lots of good studies of young people, old people, babies, we now know that the average school child has atherosclerosis in their arteries. I'm an adult. I've got more than the children, all right, unless my lifestyle is preventing it. So most of us are living right here. We have no blockage that we can detect to our chest heart. Everything's fine. But we're having blockages to our brain heart. And it's producing effects. And of course, as we get older and the blockages get worse, the effects are worse. So the fact is that atherosclerosis, this blockage of the arteries, is not really part of God's plan. It's not inevitable. It does not have to happen. Okay? In fact, modern epidemiology, and my master's degree is in epidemiology, so I'm technically an epidemiologist. Modern epidemiology reveals that this atherosclerosis is the result of deviating from the master's plan. So it's not only not part of the plan, it's deviating from the plan. Did you know that Harvard University has studied Genesis 1:29? The diet designed for mankind described in the most ancient of historical records fulfills 95% of what nutritional epidemiology has taught us or discovered. Here's what I'm talking about. Genesis 1:29. And God said, "See, I have given you every herb that yields seed which is upon the face of the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed, to you it shall be for food." So when I was converted, and they were studying the Bible in my home with me and my wife, when I accepted the reality that God was my creator, this verse made me a vegetarian. That's what everybody called it. In other words, I believe God, as my creator, had designed my diet. So, of course, I wanted to follow it, because if that's true, that God designed it, that would be the diet that would be the most healthy for me, right? I mean, why would he give me a diet that wasn't good for me? So I was telling you that Harvard has studied it. Let me show you something. By the way, tree nuts are probably the most healthy thing you can eat. Tree nuts, raw tree nuts. Now, don't put oil and salt on them. Harvard did a study, nurses' health study, 85,000 nurses. The health professional follow-up study was doctors and dentists, 42,000. Over 100,000 professionals, and what they found was that each daily serving of fruits and vegetables reduced the risk of coronary heart disease by 4%. Here's the little chart. This was published over 10 years ago. So here's the servings, okay, and here's the risk of heart disease. They started with 3 or less as 1. Compared to that, basically it went down. So that sort of confirms Genesis 1:29, doesn't it? And I talked with Walter Willett. I have the privilege at being connected with lifestyle medicine like I am. I've had the privilege of meeting and talking with different experts, and one of them is Walter Willett from Harvard. And I asked him about this study, how they were studying Genesis 1:29. And we had an interesting conversation. He hadn't realized that's what they did. By the way, here's one of my favorite books, is Ministry of Healing. And this is a quote I take from there. "Grains, fruits, nuts, and vegetables, prepared in as simple and natural a manner as possible, are the most healthful and nourishing foods." So we even have additional insight beyond Genesis 1:29. Now I want to show you something here, a couple more things, and then I'm going to close. This is taken from the New England Journal of Medicine in 2009. And this was a study looking at bypasses, okay? Bypass operations to bypass clogged arteries in the heart. And what they were wanting to find out was, this was a study done of about almost 2,000 people, and they were trying to figure out, the surgeons want to know, how can we make this operation last longer? Now, if you had one, you would be interested in that too, right? You don't want to have to do this every week. So what they did was, they had found that there was 2 ways they were harvesting the vein out of the leg, the saphenous vein that they used to bypass the arteries. And the most common way in the past was what we call open harvesting, or they would actually make an incision all the way up. If you've ever seen anyone, they have it all the way up their leg and then above the knee. Take this long vein out of there. But they've got a new technique. It's called laparoscopic, and you just make a few holes. You don't have to cut the whole thing, and that's called endoscopic. My apologies, not laparoscopic. They're related, but anyway. And then they combined. So what they looked at was the failure rate, how in 12 to 18 months, what percentage of the veins clogged up, okay? And they found that they were only 38% if they used the open method, but it was almost 47% if they used the endoscopic. So the surgeons who looked at this study said, hey, this shows that we should be using open harvest. and have the vein last longer. But now, I'm not a surgeon. I'm a lifestyle medicine doctor. And I look at this and I say, my goodness, we shouldn't be doing this, because about 43% fail in 12 to 18 months. And yet most people who get this are never told that. They're not informed that this is all this is going to last. Now here, compare it to this. This is a left anterior descending artery of a heart. Dr. Crow from the Cleveland Clinic. Dr. Esselstyn was the doctor who advised him. Dr. Crow could not take the medicine to lower his cholesterol. So Dr. Esselstyn put him on a Genesis 129 diet. And here's what happened. It was, 32 months on a plant-based diet without cholesterol-lowering medication. And I don't know if you can see this. I apologize if the image isn't better. But this artery over here has nice, open, there's no blockages. So not only, look what this is saying. This man had serious blockages, and in 32 months, he melted, his body took it away. So not only can a Genesis 129 diet help prevent blockage, but if you already have it, it can reverse it. It's good news. It's good news. But you know something? Let me close this off with this. We all know that there's a difference between knowing what to do and actually doing it. Knowing what to do is actually, in some ways, the easy part of the problem. But the hard part is doing it. Now watch. This is important. Don't let the devil deprive you of catching this next point. Of the two hearts, do you realize that one of them is important in helping us do this? Which heart in your body is going to be required to function well if you're going to do what you know is right? So let's connect the dot here. What we need is not an anatomical transplant. We don't want a new heart. We want an attitudinal transplant. Now, can we get that? Can we get an attitudinal transplant? We need new wiring for our brain. We'll talk about that another time. How about this? Here's a physician who says, I do heart transplants. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you. Now, which heart? Is this talking about the chest heart? I will take the heart of stone out of your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. Can't be sure yet. But the next verse, I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you will keep my judgments and do them. This is a promise of a brain-heart transplant. An attitudinal transplant. And you know how this works? Let me show you something very interesting. Here's a quote from Ellen White. Some of you know who. Here's how she explains it. A new heart also will I give you means a new heart, a new mind will I give you. This change of heart is always attended by a clear conception of Christian duty and understanding of truth. The clearness of our view of truth will be proportionate to our understanding of the Word of God. And goes on. So this transplant is connected to our will, our brain. So let me explain to you how this works. It's a brain-heart transplant. Talk about here in Ezekiel. And the surgeon uses two key instruments. Okay? Christ's sacrifice and the Holy Spirit's work. So in Romans we read, but God commendeth his love toward us in that while we were yet sinners. Listen, my friends, this is the best news that I ever learned as I was coming to know God, was that while I was still a sinner, God loved me and did things for me. I don't know if any of you like me, but I feel I'm still a sinner. And I am glad to know that God is doing for me what I don't deserve. Christ died for us. And much more then, being now justified by his blood we shall be saved from wrath through him. There's another verse that says that he which has begun a good work in you is able to complete it. My friends, I believe, I haven't met all of you, I don't know you personally, but I believe that if you're like most of us, we struggle to hold on to that promise that God has saved us, that we're okay for eternity. And I just want to tell you, there's assurance in God's Word that if we accept the gift, the salvation is sure. And then look at this other part, the Holy Spirit's work. Look at here in John 16:8 with me. And when he is come, he will reprove the world of sin and righteousness and of judgment. But there's more to it than that, because a change in our attitude leads to a change in our inner and outer life. Do you realize that we actually love to obey God's word? My wife can tell you, I have sinned I'm sure this week, still this week, I am sure that I sinned against my wife in some ways, words, or thoughts this week. So am I lost? No. I didn't want to do that. When I realized what I had done, I was repentant. That's not me. I'm sorry I did that. That's not my choice. I am assured of my salvation, even though I may stumble or fall, or even sometimes I might be mad and angry and willful against God. But when I come to my senses, I find he's still my Father. And notice this, his commandments are not grievous, 1 John 5:3. When we are converted, God's commands aren't grievous. There's something we want. Let me just close with this illustration. What's that? I'm sorry, what did you say? Can you hear me now? These little things are just amazing. That's an older one. But it's frustrating, isn't it, sometimes? The coverage is so bad. You can't get through. Can't hear what they're saying. If we don't have proper blood flow to the brain, I wonder how many times God is saying, John, can you hear me? John. I'm saying, Lord, where are you? Listen, my friends, the reason for healthy living is not to earn salvation. It is to help us have a connection with God so that we don't have this poor coverage problem. As you work on following God's counsel in Genesis 1:29 and elsewhere, it's not to earn salvation. You already have been given salvation. It's to have a better connection with God. And it works. And science is showing that it works. That's kind of exciting. So, I already mentioned to you this afternoon, I'll be talking about that. Thank you for your time. I pray that you, like me, will realize that healthy living is it's a part of celebrating God's gift to us. And don't let anybody make you feel guilty because you're not doing everything you know. That's part of life. But God will give you a transplant and help you love His Word even more. Thank you.